The living room was filled with the sound of forced laughter and shallow chatter, but Emma could feel her heart pounding in her chest. She sat quietly in the corner, trying to make herself invisible, but the tension in the air was suffocating. Her adoptive father, Mark, suddenly barked her name, his voice cutting through the noise like a whip. "Emma, stand up," he commanded, his tone sharp and unforgiving. All eyes turned to her, and she felt her face flush with embarrassment. Slowly, she rose to her feet, unsure of what she had done this time to provoke his anger. It didn't take much for her adoptive parents to find a reason to humiliate her. Earlier that evening, Emma had made a harmless joke during dinner, pretending to announce a fake inheritance check. She thought it would lighten the mood, but instead, it had triggered Mark's fury. "You thought that was funny?" Mark demanded, his face red with anger. "Embarrassing us like that in front of everyone?" "It was just a joke," Emma stammered, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean—" "You didn't mean—" Linda, her adoptive mother, interrupted, her voice cold and cutting. "Do you think this family is a joke, Emma?" Before Emma could respond, Mark stormed across the room and grabbed a length of rope from the corner. Her stomach dropped as she realized what was about to happen. "Sit down," he yelled, pointing to a chair in the middle of the room. Humiliated and terrified, Emma sank into the chair as Mark tied her wrists tightly. The rope bit into her skin, and she fought back tears as the room erupted into murmurs and laughter. Her adoptive brother Ethan leaned against the wall with a smirk on his face, clearly enjoying her humiliation. "This," Mark announced to the room, gesturing toward Emma, "is what happens when you disrespect this family." Emma bit her lip, refusing to cry in front of them. The voices around her blurred into a cruel background noise as she wished for the ground to swallow her whole. And then the door slammed open. The sharp sound silenced the room, and everyone turned to see who had entered. Standing in the doorway was a man Emma hadn't seen in years. Daniel, her childhood friend. Dressed in a tailored suit, Daniel looked completely out of place in the chaos of the house. His piercing gaze swept over the scene, lingering on Emma and the ropes around her wrists. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. The room fell silent as Daniel stepped inside, his presence commanding attention. He looked at Mark and Linda with a mixture of disbelief and disgust, then back at Emma, who sat frozen in the chair, her wrists bound tightly with rope. "Untie her," Daniel said, his voice cold and unyielding. "This doesn't concern you," Mark replied, his bravado faltering slightly under Daniel's piercing glare. "Ooh, it concerns me now," Daniel shot back, stepping further into the room. His eyes never left Emma, and for a moment, his expression softened. "Are you okay, Emma?" he asked gently. Emma nodded, though her throat was tight with unshed tears. She couldn't bring herself to speak, the humiliation still fresh and raw. "This is discipline," Linda interjected, her voice sharp. "She needs to learn respect." Daniel's jaw tightened and his voice rose slightly, his anger barely contained. "This isn't discipline. This is cruelty." Mark hesitated, clearly unsure of how to respond. Daniel's presence was overwhelming, and the tension in the room was suffocating. The other relatives, who had been murmuring and laughing moments ago, now stood awkwardly, avoiding eye contact. "Untie her," Daniel repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. Grumbling under his breath, Mark finally stepped forward and loosened the ropes around Emma's wrists. Her arms fell free, and she immediately began rubbing the red marks left behind. Daniel turned to Emma, crouching in front of her so they were at eye level. "You don't have to stay here," he said softly. "Pack your things. You're coming with me." "What?" Linda's voice rose in disbelief. "You can't just take her." "Oh, I can," Daniel replied, his tone icy. "And I will. You've proven you don't deserve her." "You don't understand," Mark started, but Daniel cut him off. "No, Mark, I understand perfectly," Daniel said, his voice steady but filled with quiet fury. "I've watched you tear her down for years. That ends today." Mark and Linda exchanged a panicked look. They knew they couldn't challenge Daniel. His success and influence far outweighed theirs, and they relied on him too much to risk alienating him completely. "This is a mistake," Linda hissed, her face twisted with anger. "The only mistake," Daniel said, his voice calm but firm, "is the way you've treated her." He turned back to Emma, his expression softening again. "Go pack your things," he repeated. Emma hesitated for a moment, glancing at Mark and Linda, who stood frozen in place. Then, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders, she stood and walked toward the stairs. Her steps were hesitant at first, but as she climbed, she felt a growing sense of relief. Upstairs, Emma quickly gathered her belongings, stuffing them into a small bag. Her hands trembled as she packed, the reality of what was happening finally sinking in. She was leaving. When she returned to the living room, Daniel was waiting for her by the door. He took her bag without a word and opened the door for her. "Let's go," he said, his tone firm but kind. Emma stepped outside, the cold night air hitting her face like a breath of freedom. Daniel's sleek black car was parked in the driveway, its headlights cutting through the darkness. As they reached the car, Daniel opened the passenger door for her. "Get in," he said. Emma slid into the seat, her heart pounding in her chest. Behind them, Mark and Linda stood on the porch, their faces a mixture of anger and disbelief. Ethan peeked out from behind them, his usual smirk replaced by something that almost looked like regret. Daniel climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. The roar of the car drowned out the murmurs from the porch as they pulled away. Emma glanced back once, just once, to see the house shrinking into the distance. "You don't need to look back anymore," Daniel said, his voice steady. "You're free now." For the first time in years, Emma felt a flicker of hope. The drive was quiet at first, the hum of the car engine filling the silence. Emma sat stiffly in the passenger seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She couldn't bring herself to speak, her mind still reeling from everything that had just happened. Daniel glanced at her briefly, his expression softening. "You don't have to say anything right now," he said gently, "but I want you to know you're safe with me." Emma nodded, her throat too tight to respond. She stared out the window, watching the dark streets blur past. For the first time in years, she felt a strange sense of relief, though it was mixed with uncertainty. After about 20 minutes, the car pulled into a long driveway. Emma's eyes widened as she took in the sight before her. Daniel's house wasn't just a house. It was a sprawling estate, with perfectly manicured lawns and a modern, elegant design that looked like something out of a magazine. "This is your house?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel smiled faintly as he parked the car. Yeah, it's home." He stepped out of the car and walked around to open her door. Emma hesitated for a moment before stepping out, clutching her small bag tightly. "Come on," Daniel said, gesturing toward the front door. "Let's get you settled." As they entered the house, Emma couldn't help but feel overwhelmed. The interior was just as stunning as the exterior, high ceilings, sleek furniture, and large windows that let in the soft glow of the moonlight. "You can stay here as long as you need," Daniel said, leading her down a hallway. "There's no rush to figure anything out. Just focus on resting and feeling safe." He opened a door to a cozy guest room. The bed was neatly made, and the room was decorated in warm, neutral tones. It was simple but inviting, and Emma felt a lump rise in her throat. "This is for me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Of course," Daniel replied, his tone gentle. "You deserve a place where you can feel at peace." Emma set her bag down on the bed, her hands still shaking. She turned to Daniel, her eyes brimming with tears. "Why are you doing this for me?" she asked, her voice breaking. Daniel hesitated for a moment, then stepped closer. "Because you don't deserve what they did to you," he said softly. "You've been through enough, Emma. I couldn't just stand by and let it continue." Emma looked down, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. She had spent so many years feeling unwanted, unloved, and now here was someone who cared, someone who had come back for her when no one else had. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Daniel gave her a small smile. "Get some rest," he said. "We'll talk more in the morning." He turned to leave, but before he could step out of the room, Emma called out to him. "Daniel?" He paused, looking back at her. "I don't know how to repay you for this," she said, her voice trembling. "You don't have to," Daniel replied. "Just focus on yourself. That's all I want." With that, he left the room, closing the door softly behind him. That night, Emma lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling. The events of the evening played over and over in her mind, but for the first time in years, she didn't feel trapped. She didn't feel alone. The next morning, Emma woke to the smell of coffee and something sweet. She hesitated for a moment before stepping out of the room, following the scent to the kitchen. Daniel was there, standing by the stove, flipping pancakes. He looked up when he saw her and smiled. "Good morning," he said. "I hope you're hungry." Emma blinked, momentarily stunned by the sight of him cooking. "You didn't have to do this," she said, her voice soft. "I wanted to," Daniel replied, setting a plate of pancakes on the counter. "You've been through enough. The least I can do is make you breakfast." Emma sat down at the counter, her heart feeling lighter than it had in years. As she took a bite of the pancakes, she couldn't help but smile. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she belonged somewhere. The days that followed were unlike anything Emma had ever experienced. For the first time in years, she felt safe. There were no harsh words, no cruel punishments, and no constant fear of making a mistake. Instead, there was peace and Daniel. Daniel made it clear from the start that he wasn't just offering her a place to stay. He wanted her to heal. One morning, as they sat on the patio overlooking the sprawling garden, he brought it up gently. "Emma," he began, his voice calm but serious, "I think it might help if you talked to someone. A therapist, maybe." Emma froze, her fork hovering over her plate. "A therapist," she repeated, her voice uncertain. Daniel nodded. "I know it might sound intimidating, but you've been through so much. You don't have to carry it all on your own." Emma looked down at her plate, her appetite suddenly gone. The idea of opening up to a stranger about everything she had endured felt overwhelming. "I don't know if I can do that," she admitted quietly. Daniel reached across the table, his hand resting gently on hers. "You don't have to decide right now," he said. "But just think about it, okay? You deserve to feel better, Emma. You deserve to heal." His words stayed with her long after their conversation ended. That night, as she lay in bed, she thought about all the years she had spent feeling small and powerless. Maybe Daniel was right. Maybe it was time to start letting go of the pain. A week later, Emma found herself sitting in a cozy office, across from a kind-looking woman with warm eyes. Dr. Harper introduced herself with a gentle smile, her voice soothing and calm. "Ms. No rush," Dr. Harper said. "We'll go at your pace. This is your space to talk about whatever you feel comfortable sharing." At first, Emma struggled to find the words. She fidgeted with her hands, her voice barely above a whisper as she recounted small pieces of her story. But as the sessions continued, she began to open up more. She talked about the years of neglect and cruelty she had endured at the hands of her adoptive family. She talked about the constant feeling of being unwanted, of never being good enough. And slowly she began to unpack the weight she had been carrying for so long. Dr. Harper helped her see that none of it was her fault. The shame and guilt she had been holding on to didn't belong to her. It belonged to the people who had hurt her. Meanwhile, Daniel was always there, quietly supporting her in the background. He never pushed her to talk about her therapy sessions, but he was always ready to listen if she wanted. One evening, after a particularly emotional session, Emma found herself sitting in the living room with Daniel. The fire crackled softly in the fireplace, casting a warm glow over the room. "I told Dr. Harper about the prank," Emma said suddenly, her voice breaking the comfortable silence. Daniel looked up from the book he was reading, his expression attentive. The one that started everything?" he asked. Emma nodded. "It was so stupid," she said, her voice trembling. "I just wanted to make them laugh. I thought, maybe if I could make them laugh, they'd like me more." Daniel set his book down and moved to sit beside her. "Emma," he said gently, "you didn't do anything wrong. You were just trying to connect with them. That's not stupid, it's human." Emma's eyes filled with tears, and she looked away, ashamed of her emotions. But Daniel reached out, tilting her chin so she was looking at him. "They didn't deserve you," he said firmly, "and they didn't see how amazing you are, but that's their loss, not yours." For the first time, Emma let herself cry in front of him, and Daniel stayed by her side, holding her hand and letting her know she wasn't alone. As the weeks turned into months, Emma began to rediscover herself. Daniel, ever the encourager, noticed her love for art and set up a small studio for her in one of the spare rooms. "I thought you might like a space to paint," he said one afternoon, leading her into the room. Emma's eyes widened as she took in the easels, canvases, and shelves stocked with paints and brushes. "You did this for me?" she asked, her voice filled with disbelief. "Of course," Daniel said with a smile. "You're talented, Emma. You just need the chance to let it out." At first, Emma was hesitant. It had been years since she had picked up a paintbrush, and she wasn't sure if she still had it in her. But as she stood in front of the blank canvas, something inside her stirred. She dipped her brush into the paint and began to work, letting her emotions flow onto the canvas. Hours passed, and by the time she stepped back to look at her work, she felt a sense of pride she hadn't felt in years. When she showed the painting to Daniel, his reaction was immediate. "Emma, this is incredible," he said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. For the first time, Emma felt seen not as a burden, not as a failure, but as someone with worth and talent. One day, Daniel came home with a flyer for a local art competition. "You should enter," he said, handing it to her. Emma hesitated, her old doubts creeping in. "I don't know if I'm good enough," she said. "You are," Daniel said firmly. "And even if you don't win, it doesn't matter. What matters is that you're putting yourself out there." With his encouragement, Emma decided to take the leap. She submitted one of her paintings, and to her surprise, it was selected as a finalist. The night of the competition, Daniel stood by her side, his presence steady and reassuring. When her name was announced as the winner, Emma felt a rush of emotions: pride, disbelief, and most of all, gratitude. As she stood on the stage, holding her award, she looked out into the crowd and saw Daniel smiling at her. In that moment, she realized just how much he had done for her, and how much he meant to her. The art competition had been a turning point for Emma. Winning wasn't just about the recognition, it was about proving to herself that she was capable, talented, and worthy. But as much as she had grown, there was still one part of her past she hadn't faced: her adoptive family. One evening, as she and Daniel sat in the living room, he brought it up. "Emma," he said gently, "I got a call today." She looked up from her sketchbook, her brow furrowing. "From who?" "Your adoptive parents," Daniel replied, his tone careful. "They're hosting a family gathering next weekend. They want you to come." Emma's stomach twisted at the thought. "Why would they want me there?" she asked, her voice tinged with bitterness. Daniel hesitated. "I think they're trying to save face," he admitted. "But that doesn't matter. What matters is what you want. Do you want to go?" Emma stared at him, unsure of how to answer. Part of her wanted to say no, to leave that chapter of her life behind forever. But another part of her, the part that had spent years craving their approval, felt drawn to the idea of confronting them. "I don't know," she said finally. Daniel leaned forward, his gaze steady. "If you go, it's not for them," he said. "It's for you. To show them that they didn't break you, that you're stronger than they ever gave you credit for." His words stayed with her, and after a few days of thinking it over, Emma made her decision. "I'll go," she told Daniel, "but only if you come with me." Daniel smiled. I wouldn't let you face them alone. The day of the gathering arrived, and Emma felt a mix of nerves and determination as she and Daniel pulled up to the house. It looked the same as it always had, cold, unwelcoming, and full of memories she'd rather forget. Daniel placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You've got this," he said. Emma nodded, taking a deep breath before stepping out of the car. Inside, the atmosphere was just as tense as she remembered. Her adoptive parents, Mark and Linda, greeted her with forced smiles, their eyes flickering nervously to Daniel, who stood protectively by her side. "Emma," Linda said, her voice overly sweet. "It's been so long. We're so glad you could make it." Emma forced a polite smile. "I wasn't sure if I should come," she said honestly. Mark cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. "Well, you're here now. That's what matters." The other relatives murmured their greetings, but Emma could feel their judgmental stares. She knew they were all wondering why she had come back and why she was with someone like Daniel, whose success and confidence made him stand out in the room. As the evening went on, Emma found herself growing more and more frustrated. Her adoptive parents acted as though nothing had happened, as though they hadn't spent years tearing her down. Finally, she couldn't hold it in any longer. "Why did you invite me here?" she asked, her voice cutting through the chatter. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to her. Linda blinked, clearly caught off guard. "We wanted to see you," she said, her tone defensive. "Really?" Emma said, her voice steady but firm. "Because it feels more like you wanted to pretend everything's fine, like you didn't spend years making me feel like I was nothing." Mark's face darkened. "That's enough, Emma," he said sharply. "No," Emma shot back, her voice rising. "It's not enough. You don't get to treat me like that and then act like it never happened." The tension in the room was palpable, but Emma didn't care. For the first time, she was standing up for herself, and it felt liberating. "You tied me to a chair," she continued, her voice trembling with emotion. "You humiliated me in front of everyone, and for what? A stupid prank? I was just a kid, and all I ever wanted was for you to love me. But you couldn't even give me that." Linda looked away, her face pale, while Mark clenched his jaw, clearly struggling to come up with a response. Daniel stepped forward then, his presence commanding. "Emma doesn't owe you anything," he said, his voice calm but firm. "She's here because she's stronger than you ever gave her credit for, but don't mistake her kindness for your weakness. She's not the same girl you tried to break." Emma felt a surge of gratitude as Daniel spoke, his words giving her the strength to continue. "I'm not here for you," she said, her voice steady. "I'm here for me, to show you that I'm not the person you tried to make me believe I was. I'm better than that. I'm better than you." With that, she turned and walked toward the door, her head held high. Daniel followed, his hand resting gently on her back as they stepped outside. As they reached the car, Emma let out a shaky breath, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "You were incredible in there," Daniel said, his voice filled with pride. Emma looked up at him, her eyes brimming with tears. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said. Daniel smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You didn't need me," he said softly. "You've always had that strength inside you. I just helped you see it." Emma felt her heart swell at his words, and for the first time, she truly believed them. The drive back to Daniel's house was quiet, but it wasn't the heavy silence Emma had grown used to in her past. This silence was peaceful, filled with unspoken understanding. She stared at the window, watching the city lights blur past, her mind replaying the events of the evening. For the first time, she felt free, truly free. When they arrived at Daniel's estate, he parked the car and turned to her. "Do you want to talk about it?" he asked gently. Emma shook her head, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Not tonight," she said. "I think I just want to sit for a while." Daniel nodded. "Come on," he said, stepping out of the car. They walked to the patio, where the night sky stretched endlessly above them. The stars were bright, and the cool breeze carried the faint scent of flowers from the garden. Emma sat down on one of the chairs, pulling her knees to her chest as she gazed up at the sky. Danielle joined her, sitting close but giving her space. For a while, neither of them spoke. The quiet was comforting, a reminder that she didn't have to fill the silence with words. Finally, Emma broke the stillness. "I never thought I'd feel this way," she said softly. Daniel turned to her, his expression curious. "What way?" "Free," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "For so long I thought I'd always be stuck in that house, in that life. But now, it's like I can finally breathe." Daniel smiled, his eyes warm. "You deserve that, Emma. You deserve to feel free, to feel happy." Emma looked at him, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I don't think I could have done it without you," she admitted. Daniel shook his head. "You give me too much credit," he said. "You've always had that strength inside you. I just reminded you it was there." Emma's gaze lingered on him, and for the first time she allowed herself to really see him, not just as the boy she had known years ago, but as the man he had become. He had been her anchor, her protector, and now, she realized, he was so much more. "Daniel," she said hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked at her, his expression softening. "What is it?" "I don't know how to say this," she began, her cheeks flushing, "but I think I've been feeling something for a while now, and I don't know if it's just because of everything you've done for me or if it's something more, but, Daniel reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "Emma," he said, his voice steady, "you don't have to explain. I've felt it too." Her breath caught in her throat as she looked into his eyes, searching for any hint of doubt. But there was none. His gaze was steady, filled with a warmth that made her heart ache in the best way. "I've cared about you for a long time," Daniel continued. "Even when we were kids, you were always special to me. And now, seeing the woman you've become, seeing your strength, your kindness, I can't help but feel something more." Emma felt tears welling in her eyes, but this time they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, of joy, of finally feeling seen and loved for who she was. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," she admitted, her voice trembling, "but I want to try. I want to see where this goes." Daniel smiled, his hand tightening around hers. "We'll take it one step at a time," he said. "There's no rush. I just want to be here for you however you need me." Emma nodded, a small smile breaking through her tears. For the first time in her life, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. That night as she lay in bed, Emma couldn't stop thinking about Daniel's words. She had spent so many years feeling unworthy of love, but now she realized that love wasn't something she had to earn. It was something she deserved, simply for being herself. And with Daniel by her side, she knew she was finally ready to embrace it. Months passed, and Emma's life began to take on a new rhythm, one filled with peace, purpose, and love. Her art career flourished, with her paintings gaining recognition in local galleries. She spent her days creating, pouring her emotions onto the canvas, and her nights were often spent with Daniel, sharing quiet moments that felt like home. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Daniel called her out to the garden. Emma stepped outside, her bare feet brushing against the soft grass, and found him standing near the fountain, a small box in his hand. Her heart skipped a beat as she approached him, her breath catching in her throat. "Daniel?" she asked, her voice trembling. He turned to her, his expression soft but serious. "Emma," he began, "I've watched you grow into the most incredible person. You've faced so much, and yet you've come out stronger, braver, and more beautiful than ever. You've taught me what it means to love someone not just for who they are, but for everything they've been through." Emma felt tears welling in her eyes as he dropped to one knee, opening the box to reveal a simple but elegant ring. "I don't want to just be the person who helped you heal," Daniel said, his voice steady. "I want to be the person who stands by your side for the rest of your life. Emma, will you marry me?" For a moment, Emma couldn't speak. Her heart felt like it might burst from the overwhelming emotions coursing through her. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking. Then louder, "Yes, Daniel, I'll marry you." Daniel slipped the ring onto her finger, and as he stood, Emma threw her arms around him, holding him tightly. In that moment, surrounded by the soft glow of the evening light, Emma realized just how far she had come. She had turned her pain into strength, her fear into courage, and her loneliness into love. And as Daniel held her close, she knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with hope, happiness, and a love that would last a lifetime. Thank you so much for watching this story on Emma's Stories. If you enjoyed it and want to hear more inspiring and heartfelt stories, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel. Your support means the world to us and helps us bring more amazing stories to life. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload, and let us know in the comments what you thought about today's story or what you'd like to see next. This is Emma's Stories, where every story has the power to inspire. See you in the next video.